Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. My name is Jorge Barro. I'm a fellow in public finance here at the Baker Institute. We're happy to be joined today by Efraim Berkovich. Efraim is an economist at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of computational dynamics at the Penn Wharton budget model. So today we'll be talking about the long-run macroeconomic effects of the pandemic. And to that extent, we'll be talking about some of the items that are a little bit different from sort of the business cycle recovery. So once the business cycle has recovered, once the recession ends, there will be a number of sort of policy issues that policymakers will have to address with regards to the long-run impact of the pandemic on the economy. So today, Efraim will be talking about the impact of the pandemic on education, and then I'll follow up with a discussion of the impact of the pandemic on demographics and the fiscal outlook. So on that note, I will turn it over to Efraim to talk about the impact of the pandemic on education.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you to the Baker Institute for having me on. So let me share my slides here for a second. It'll let me. There we go. There we go. And one second here. Slideshow. There we go. So this is coming out of work that we at the Penn Wharton budget model have been doing recently, looking at the effects that remote schooling has had on our children. And we have a report that's out on our website for those of you that are interested in getting a little bit more information. So for those of you that don't know, many public schools have been closed and have been operating with what's called virtual learning, which, depending on the school district and depending on the school, involves different things. So initially, some schools were operating with what's called asynchronous learning, where you would just tell the kids to go look at something on YouTube and hand in some assignments. As the pandemic has progressed and school districts have adapted a bit more, there's been more synchronous learning where you're in the Zoom meeting. And some school districts also have been able to adopt hybrid models where there's some time in person and some time in either Zoom or asynchronous. So the question is, what is this doing to our children? And there's a lot of documentation and a lot of literature that education is related to income. And although remote learning is a bit new, there is a lot of literature coming out right now, which seems to indicate that remote learning is an inferior form of education, primarily people looking at test scores and grades and those kinds of things. So for the last year, we've been exposing 13 cohorts of kids to different levels of remote learning, school openness. And if we think that this is less valuable than in-person education, then we've exposed them to some sort of harm that will impact their future income. So some of the things that have come out, and I'll talk more in detail in a second, but we see that higher income individuals and families and students have tended to weather this a bit better, and higher performing students as well. There's evidence that they're doing all right. It's really, a lot of the impact is occurring at the lower end of income and performance and some other socioeconomic aspects, which I'll discuss in a second. So one thing I want to kind of get out of the way, because this is a question that we've gotten quite a bit from from media and various people, is, well, why does it matter, right? If everyone's kid is dumb, does it matter that my kid is dumb? And to some extent, it's not entirely a ridiculous question because you are compared against your peer group. And this is an old question to some extent in the education literature, when you're talking about, is the value of education a signaling, meaning you just get the degree, it doesn't matter what you learned, or are there some skills involved? So it's a question, I think, at that point, is education a zero-sum game, meaning if we all get educated or none of us get educated, it's all kind of the same. So under the assumption that there is some value to education, and I do have a bias having, and George, I'm sure you as well, we have invested quite a lot of time in our education. So assuming that education actually teaches you something and that allows you to become a more productive person and more productive employee, the important thing to remember here is that no one is forcing employers to hire unqualified applicants. So that's kind of the answer that I would have to people that are saying that it doesn't really matter that much if everyone's in the same boat. So employers can leave the position open, which we've seen. They might have to spend and invest time on training to make up for poor education of the applicant, or just pay people less because they're less productive. The other thing to remember is that these are 13 cohorts, but they will be competing with older and younger individuals who presumably are better trained. And most importantly, I would say, is that we are in a global economy. So to have the US labor force be less productive puts us at a huge disadvantage in competing internationally, but also nationally, because we are able to, or employers, I should say, are able to outsource work. And as you can see from some of my little notes here, the foreign immigrants coming into the country tend to be better trained, and other countries like China and even Europe have been able to, I would say, weather the school closures a bit better than the US has. So coming back, I think, to specifically the quantitative aspects of it, there was a recent Stanford study, which was in the Wall Street Journal recently, where they estimate that the cohorts have lost between 6 to 9% of future lifetime income. This is in terms of labor income from remote learning. We've done our own analysis, which, as I said, is available. So we have looked at the most recent literature that's coming out right now about the impact of virtual schooling, how it's affecting people's skills. So what we find is that math skills tend to be the most at risk for virtual schooling. In fact, this surprised me quite a bit. There was a study that came out, again, out of Stanford, that found that virtual math schooling improved math not at all. It was equivalent to not going to school. Reading skills are less impacted, but are still impacted. So we came up with a mapping between the harm of virtual schooling to the skills that the students lose. And then from that, we map it to sort of education lost. And then from that, using, again, these are statistical estimates, we map that to the expected lower wage that a lower educated individual would get. So we take those wage reductions, we look at the estimates that the Penn-Wharton budget model microsimulation generates. And what that model is it takes a large group of individuals in the present and statistically moves them forward, meaning looking at all of the transitions that occur that we've measured in terms of people getting married, people having kids, getting more education, and basically projects what the future demographics would look like. And from that, we were able to see what an individual would be expected to earn through time based on historical data. So we applied the two together, and that's how we come up with our estimate of how much loss there is from a reduced education. So the post that we put out is this cost of virtual schooling, and we broke it up by racial groups and income groups. Our data set is to look at 63 school districts in the Philadelphia area, plus the big city of Philadelphia. And what we find in terms of combining the level of remote learning with who is being exposed to it are some of these types of statistics, and there's many more available on the website. So if you look at the whole sample, what we see is that there's an expected 11% loss for the younger students in lifetime income, and a smaller but still very significant about 8.5% loss for the older students. And the reason for that is that the literature seems to indicate that younger kids really are the ones that need in-person schooling more. So there's a differential loss to them. And as you can see, it's a bit higher. Now, in the suburbs, we actually found that there was not a lot of differentiation amongst both income groups, which I'm not even mentioning here, but also amongst racial groups, meaning that white children, black children are exposed to almost similar levels of school openness. So whatever differentiation we're going to see, there is some. I'm not going to say there's none, but the primary difference that we're seeing, and this has, I think, been mentioned in other studies that other people have done, is coming from a city to non-city divide. So when we include the large Philadelphia school district, which has been closed to in-person schooling this whole time, I think just now they're starting to barely open up. It's from that we see these differentiations between the groups. So, when we do the whole data sets, we have like a 1.5% difference in lifetime income, where black children are going to earn even less than white children. Although, I would reiterate that both groups are being harmed quite significantly by the reduced amount of schooling that we're providing right now. So, what do we do with this information? And this is preliminary work right now. We're going to delve into this much more, I think, in the coming weeks and months at Penn Wharton. But I took the overlapping generations macroeconomic model that we have and plugged in the differentiated labor productivities. So in that model, we have a population and different cohorts in the population. They have different labor productivities and they transition between them. So what I did here is a very basic first pass where I simply reduced the productivity of the 13 cohorts that are being affected right now, put them into the model and see how that affected GDP. So you can see that, I think unsurprisingly, GDP trends down as these kids enter the workforce. It takes a little bit of time for them to come in, and once they're in the workforce, they're they don't have the productivity that we would expect in the baseline. So this graph is the difference from baseline. This is not meant to say that GDP is going to go down. This is a baseline without COVID, and then this is with the this is the baseline without the loss from education from COVID, and then we impose the loss. So just to, because it's hard to see on the graph, here's some numbers. So we were estimating, as you saw, between like 11 and 9% loss. So that would be the numbers to look at in terms of reduced GDP. But for completeness, and there may be some policies that we can take right now, which may reduce that loss. I added the potential 5% and 7% losses. So in 2030, these kids really have not, or the big bulk of them have not started to work and are not in their productive years. But by the time you start hitting 2040, 2050, we see that these losses are very significant. So I think the question here is, what can be done to ameliorate some of these things, and when can we do it? There is, I think, this baked into the cake loss that we have to understand is coming, and policymakers should be thinking about what can be done right now, because as we wait longer and longer, it becomes more difficult to make up for some of these losses that the kids are going to feel themselves, but also obviously all of us as these children become adults and work in the economy. So that's.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Efraim. I know that Penn Wharton budget model has put a lot of resources into understanding the impact of the pandemic. And I think that last graph that you showed really highlights the fact that there are a number of things. Yes, thank you. That one really shows that there are a number of things that will take years to materialize, or years before we ever know the full extent of the impact. And I think that's why it's important that policymakers really shift their focus onto addressing some of these issues pretty early on. So I'll shift focus now, but I also wanted to remind our audience, if you have any questions, certainly feel free to submit them in the Q&A box, and we'd be happy to answer them towards the end of the presentation. So Efraim, I think you need to stop sharing your screen before I can share mine at the bottom. There we go. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about demographics, and kind of in the same way that Efraim talked about the impact of education on the long-term macroeconomic outlook. These things take a really long time to materialize and to sort of unfold. So the pandemic had a significant impact on demographics, and what I'll do is I'll talk about some of the historical demographic trends in the United States. I'll talk about their relation to economic growth, and I'll talk about how the pandemic impacted specific demographic variables and how we might anticipate that that'll affect economic growth down the road. So the top graph here shows the birth rate since the early 1900s. So this is something that really kind of highlights what's happened in the United States over the last 120 years or so. So at the beginning of the 1900s, there was a sharp drop in the birth rate as the domestic economy kind of shifted away from agricultural and towards manufacturing and services. So we had a sharp decline kind of leading into the 1930s, and then sort of towards the 1940s, something very unexpected happened, unexpected from the perspective of people of that time. There was a surge that we call today the baby boom of the 1940s, 50s, and a little bit into the 60s. And then the birth rate kind of stabilized, then sort of trended downward up until today. So at the same time that we had a decline in the birth rate, we had sort of a significant improvement in life expectancy. So advancements in medical technologies and healthcare allowed people to sort of live much longer lives. And so these two things kind of characterize or the two sort of defining aspects of demographic changes over the last 120 years or so. So what's the net effect? So the birth rate decline, that's something that reduces the size of the population, but people also live longer lives. The net effect of those two things was actually that, you know, there was a steady decline in the population growth rate after the baby boom. So here we can see, this is the population growth rate. We see a surge resulting from the baby boom and sort of a persistent decline in the population growth rate ever since. So just to summarize, the last 120 years have been kind of characterized by declining birth rates and the baby boom and an increase in life expectancy. So what has been the impact of demographics on economic growth? So we usually think of labor growth in the labor force as being one of the primary drivers of economic growth. And what we see here is, so this is basically the growth rate of the labor force with a trend line superimposed onto it. So in the trend line, we can clearly see the impact that the baby boom generation had onto the labor force. We see significant growth in the labor force, sort of iterated back about, or iterated forwards 20 years after the baby boomers were born. So from the 1960s to the 1980s, we saw a surge in the labor force growth rate. And of course, we had a subsequent decline, and that decline has been happening since around the 1980s. So how does this relate to general economic growth? So we can do the same thing to the growth rate of the economy. This is the growth rate of real GDP. We see that it's also been declining over time. Now, what we can do is compare these two trends directly. So if we look at the labor force and economic growth, we see that since about the 1970s, both have been trending downward, almost at the same pace. So one thing to note here is that the growth rate of the economy in the 1950s was actually much higher than the growth rate of the labor force would have implied. So I'll actually come back to that in just a little while and explain why that might have happened kind of in the post-war period. But it's very clear to see that the demographics just has a huge impact on economic growth. And it's very hard to grow your economy if you're not growing your labor force. So if we want to understand how the pandemic impacted long-run economic growth, we have to understand how the pandemic impacted demographics. So at the onset of the pandemic, there were a lot of people that speculated that there might be sort of a second baby boom. And there is some historical evidence that supports that something like this might have been expected. So for example, if we have certain events like low-level hurricanes, and my colleague Rick Evans has published one of the more prominent papers in this area, he shows that low-level hurricanes and sort of certain events can have a sort of positive impact on fertility and the birth rate. So another example would be the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. Thereafter, there was a spike in births. So a number of events can lead to a spike in the birth rate. There was the hope at the onset of the pandemic that this might be the case for, with regards to the demographic outlook. An opposing force, however, is the incidence of recessions. So recessions generally tend to have a negative impact on birth rates. So what was the net effect of this? So research is suggesting that there's going to be there's this sort of projected baby bust in 2021, that there will be a decline in births by a magnitude of about 300,000. So while that may seem concerning, it does also seem to be, and we certainly hope that this is more of just a transitory effect, that some people are just kind of shifting the timing of their childbearing. Maybe they didn't want their children to be born into a pandemic. So to a large extent, this could be just a shift in timing. And some surveys do suggest that that's the case, but some share have just, I think some share is just kind of lost, at least in the near term. But there is an optimistic outlook. So over time, the recession we certainly expect will subside. We're already seeing signs of that. The CBO projects that the economy will return to its pre-pandemic peak in the middle of 2021. So in the coming months, the CBO projects that we'll be basically back on track. So the effect of the recession on the demographic outlook will eventually subside. But maybe the more optimistic outlook is that this transition to remote work has allowed people to kind of move away from densely populated areas. These densely populated areas are very costly. It reduces the feasibility of having larger families, but a shift out to the suburb could certainly change that trend. And in fact, some people attribute a shift in suburban living towards suburban living in the 1940s to the baby boom that we saw in the middle of the 20th century. So is there a second baby boom still on the horizon? We certainly remain hopeful. And if that's the case, then there could be a significant increase in economic growth down the road. So the other way that demographics have been impacted by the pandemic is through its impact on immigration. So historically, we've relied very heavily on immigration to offset certain demographic changes. So in particular, when somebody comes to the United States and they become sort of a permanent resident, that's an immediate impact on the population. The population grows immediately by the magnitude of the net immigration. But it also has sort of an indirect impact in the sense that there's a documented improvement in birth rates in the immigrant population. So to a large extent, we do rely on immigration to offset some of these demographic trends. So this is a projection provided by the U.S. Census Bureau. And what you'll see in this solid blue line in the middle is the the Census Bureau's best guess at how much the U.S. population will grow in the coming decades as a result of immigration. So the Census Bureau projects that by 2060, we'll have about a 25% increase in the population resulting from immigration. So this graph really kind of highlights how important immigration is. In an optimistic case, that number could be as high as 35, and in a more pessimistic case, it would be as low as 15%. But maybe the most telling part of this graph is the scenario that they evaluate in the absence of any immigration. That's the zero immigration sort of dotted line at the bottom. And what it suggests is that in the absence of any immigration in the coming decades, we would expect that the population, the US population, would begin to decline. So in the coming months, I'm hoping to actually launch a new macroeconomic model with some of these demographics built in. And we use data going back all the way to about 1850, when the census really started tracking in a lot of detail some of the US aspects of the US population. And so we simulate historical demographic patterns. And because this is a model, you can run demographic experiments. And what I found was that by shutting off immigration at around 1850, at the time that this data set really starts, we would have an economy today, a US economy today, that is about 20% of its current size. So that really highlights the importance of immigration on historical economic growth. And to a large extent, it highlights how important immigration is for economic growth moving forward. So how did the pandemic impact immigration? Well, there are a number of institutional problems that kind of materialized in the aftermath of the pandemic. Social distancing of the employees in the Department of Homeland Security that focused exclusively on immigration. There was a disruption in that process, and so they created a backlog. The amount of processed applications fell by 25% over the last year. That was with respect to lawful permanent resident applications as well as naturalization. So, the problems with immigration, say processing, the institutional issues have been exacerbated by the recent border crisis. But these are issues that can be resolved through policy. They're issues that can be resolved maybe through enhanced financing or maybe other public policy resolutions. But to me, one of the most concerning things with regards to the long-term economic outlook was the fact that lawful permanent resident applications submitted fell by about 5%. So, certainly the hope is that this was just a result of, people kind of hunkering down and, maybe a result of the reduction in mobility across countries caused by the pandemic. But to me, the greater concern is that maybe this was sort of the canary in the coal mines. Maybe this is a sign of things to come. If it's the case that we don't need to be physically present in our own workplace, is it the case that maybe businesses can actually outsource a larger share of their work to foreign countries? Is there going to be a reduction in the need for immigration? So again, certainly the hope is that we can sustain a very high level of immigration, but the United States has been very fortunate that we've had a lot of people wanting to come to our country. But if it's the case that employers are able to shift work to other countries and have those employers, be productive in their own home countries, then it could be the case that the outlook with respect to immigration could dampen. So the other big issue that was really impacted by the pandemic was the fiscal outlook. So our fiscal outlook took a big hit in the pandemic. Coming into the pandemic, the United States had federal debt stock of about $17.2 trillion. Even at that point, it was reasonably high. Pandemic-related fiscal aid raised that amount by about $5 trillion. We had about $3 trillion passed a year ago in 3 packages, the largest of which was the CARES Act, and the recent American Recovery Plan. So that was around $2 trillion. That increased debt by about $5 trillion, or about a 30% increase in our stock of debt. So this is the projection provided by the Congressional Budget Office. This shows historical debt leading up to the pandemic and what the CBO had projected before the pandemic. So this yellow area shows the impact of the pandemic on federal debt, but before the American Recovery Plan. The CBO has not released their projections of sort of updated their debt projections after the American Recovery Plan. But we see that we're going to be facing significantly growing debt in the near future if it's not addressed. So, I've been on record saying that the growth rate of savings was pretty substantial going forward with an aging of the population, and that the growth in the debt stock before the pandemic was something that we could tolerate in the near term, but it's inevitable that something bad, whether it's fiscal austerity or worse, is kind of waiting for us at some point in the future. At some point, we're going to have to deal with this, and whatever it is that's kind of waiting for us in the future, just moved a lot closer with the growth in the debt stock. So another thing to notice here is what happened during World War II. So we had the debt stock of around 40% leading into World War II. Obviously, that surged to over 100%. That was our historical peak before the pandemic. And fiscal austerity in the aftermath of World War II allowed debt to decline in the subsequent decades. So it's a reasonable thing to ask. We hear a lot about the impact of debt on the economy, but we've sort of seen debt grow without any consequences. So it's natural to ask, how much can debt affect economic growth? And the way that economists think about it is that when we incur government debt, we divert resources away from the private sector. So to illustrate this, we can look at the time period around World War II and take sort of a historical perspective and study what happened around that time period and try to infer from that what we might expect going forward. So in the aftermath, or I should say in the time period leading up to World War II and into World War II, you can see sort of in the early to mid 1940s, there was a significant decline in private capital growth. So this was sort of a clear result of the United States kind of shifting resources towards the production of military construction. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the war, there was a much lower need for a lot of these military expenditures. And we saw a significant shift of resources back into the private sector. There was a reduction in the growth rate of debt. This flooded the private industry with capital. And if you remember back when I showed sort of a disparity between real GDP growth and the labor force growth, we noted that that was something that happened in the 1950s. And it's possible that to a large extent, reduction in debt and a shift in resources back to the private sector caused a sustained level of economic growth in the 1950s above and beyond what labor force growth would have implied. So what would debt reduction look like today? Well, I don't know that we could expect the same level of economic growth resulting from debt reduction. So one of the big differences today relative to the aftermath of World War II is that capital is much more abundant today. So we've had a what I call a demographics-driven surge in savings. Basically, with an aging of the population, we get a lot of people who are close to retirement, and it doesn't require a change in behavior, just a change in demographics. You know, if we have an aging of the population, we have more, sort of a larger share of our population that is at a point in life where their assets tend to be higher. That's caused what again I call this demographics-driven surge in savings, kind of depressing interest rates and making capital abundant, and to a large extent, kind of dampening the impact of debt on the economy. But another significant difference between the aftermath of World War II and the current state of our economy is international capital flows. So during World War II, American investors held about 99% of all U.S. federal debt. So that's significantly different from what it is today. Today, at least about a third of all U.S. federal debt is held by foreign investors. So while I would expect economic growth to increase as a result of debt reduction, it's likely to be dampened relative to what we experienced in the aftermath of World War II. But certainly we could still expect an increase in GDP growth. So looking forward, what can policymakers do to address the fiscal outlook? So we have rising debt, and to a large extent, that's the result of a rise in outlays. So revenue is expected to stay relatively stable over the foreseeable future, but a rise in outlays is going to result for three reasons, according to the Congressional Budget Office. One is an aging of the population, and that really has a lot to do with Social Security. The second item is a rise in healthcare costs per beneficiary. So things like Medicare, Medicaid that are financed by the government are expected to cause a persistent rise in outlays. And third is interest costs, so the cost of financing our debt. But if we can resolve the first two and resolve debt issues, then certainly the interest costs will go down. But there's a big emphasis on Social Security resolution. A lot of things that we talked about today, the demographic changes in the United States, put a big strain on Social Security. These things were sort of exacerbated in the aftermath of the pandemic. Some projections suggest that the Social Security Trust Fund will exhaust an entire, anywhere between 1 to 5 years sooner in the aftermath of the pandemic. So it's something that was urgent leading up to the pandemic, and something that we critically need to resolve in the years to come. So to summarize what Efraim and I have talked about today, basically the pandemic has affected nearly every determinant of long-run economic growth. As soon as the business cycle recovery is kind of in a favorable place, as soon as we've recovered from the recession, policymakers will have to start addressing some of these long-run issues and focus on things like education, demographics and immigration, and of course, the fiscal outlook. But there are some reasons for optimism as well. So something that we didn't go into detail a whole lot was this transition to remote work. So one of the major determinants of long-run economic growth is productivity. So a lot of employers have noted a significant rise in productivity resulting from this transition to remote work. So households have lower costs of commuting into town. If this persists, and if technology continues to advance in a way that enhances productivity, we could see an economic boost in the near term. So I talked a little bit about the increased mobility and sort of the transition away from densely populated areas into suburban areas. Could there be a lagging baby boom that is awaiting us on the horizon? If that's the case, then we can expect a very favorable long-run economic outlook. And then finally, more recently, interest rates have kind of ticked up. If they continue to rise, could that enforce some level of fiscal discipline on policymakers? It's possible, but we will have to wait and find out. And on that note, I'd be happy to answer any questions. So okay, so the first question that we had, and I see the follow-up point, was the possibility that long-run economic growth could be impacted by the COVID bills. Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to mention one thing. There was a big difference in the economic environment in between the first bill and the second. So when we think about the CARES Act and the two other bills that were passed around that time, there was a surge in government debt resulting from that. But there was also a large share of that debt that was purchased by the Federal Reserve so that the Federal Reserve could, make its best attempt to stabilize the business cycle. The economic environment today is very different. So another significant difference was the rise in savings. I don't know that we've ever seen anything like the surge in savings that we experienced in the aftermath of the pandemic. So that created a more favorable environment for debt growth in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. What we see today is, continued very high savings, but certainly not at the same rate that we would have seen in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. So a very different environment in which debt is growing now relative to the environment in which debt grew a year ago. So the concern is that without this sort of residual savings, without the Federal Reserve aggressively trying to reduce interest rates, it could be the case that we see an uptick in inflation, and certainly a lot of people in the financial sector have started factoring in this projected increase in inflation. So, so the next question has to do with education. And Efraim, I think this would probably be a question for you. With the transition to remote work, could this remote education experience actually enhance job preparation? So in other words, does remote education give students a marketable skill?
So that's a good question. The way I would unpack it would be, what do we think education is useful for? And specifically, what is in-person education useful for? Because certainly, at a certain age, you can just pick up a book or use YouTube videos to figure out what you're doing. So it's clear that you learn from working in a remote environment how to interact and potentially some soft skills related to that. But if we're talking about hard skills, and in particular, I would turn the conversation back to math skills. Why do we think that math skills suffer so much from remote learning? Well, I think the answer has to do with the ability to interact and get feedback in a sort of more humanly natural way. Now, that seems to indicate right now that, and from the data that I described before, that we are failing to do that well remotely. So while it's true that I think students are picking up some skills in terms of being able to sit in front of a computer and learn to interact with people on that level, the important takeaway I would say about remote work is not so much that you're able to talk to your colleagues via Zoom and you learn how to do that. It's that you're able to translate the skills that you have and bring that to a different environment. So without those skills, it's unclear to me, at least, that we're teaching the children a useful skill just by having them sit in front of the computer. And for the younger children, I would say there's enough anecdotal stories about small children having tantrums and crying on the floor because they're being forced to sit for 3 hours in front of a computer and watch Zoom meetings. I would say we're not even teaching anything at that point. I think that's just torture. My opinion, not PWBN's.
All right, thank you, Efraim. So the next question asks whether the slowing of the baby boom or the decline in fertility is necessarily a good thing, and would a smaller number of workers having to take the expenses of the retirement population, is this a good thing? Is reduction in productivity per population? So I want to clarify in case I may have sort of been misleading there. The baby boom, I would say, was a very positive impact on our demographic outlook, and for a number of reasons, it was a very good thing. Certainly for the outlook of Social Security financing. A decline in sort of the aftermath of the baby boom, a decline in fertility and the birth rate in the aftermath of the baby boom, sort of in the years after the baby boom, I wouldn't say that's necessarily a good thing. So with regards to the economy, I would say that it's not necessarily a bad thing. If we have changing demographics, we usually think of prices adjusting in the economy to accommodate changing environments. So I don't think that an aging of the population is a bad thing or a costly thing. So we usually think of a younger population having a larger impact on the workforce, but an older population would still be contributing to a large extent, but through capital. So we usually think of people that are later in life as having a larger stock of savings. The traditional story is that when you put your money in the bank, it's not actually just sitting in the bank, that the bank takes that money and loans it out to private industry, and businesses. So whereas the economy was heavy on labor supply in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's shifting more to capital intensive as we move forward with an aging population. The big problem that we have with declining fertility, with changing demographics and an aging the population, is the design of Social Security. So Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system. In other words, current beneficiaries are financed by current workers. So the Social Security taxes that you pay on your labor income go to finance the Social Security program. And to that extent, it's really not sustainable at its current rates if we don't have, if we have an aging of the population. Basically, your outlays rise and your revenues decline over time. So that's kind of the concerning outlook with regards to Social Security. So if I painted this decline of fertility in a positive light, I certainly didn't intend to do that. What I did mean to do was kind of give a hopeful outlook with respect to demographics, the possibility that the long run effects of the transition towards suburban life could have a very positive impact on the demographic outlook, and to that extent, it could have a very positive impact on the long run outlook of economic growth. And so we have another question. Given Social Security's dire financial condition, what are the solutions that policymakers are considering to resolve the potential issues of draining the trust fund? So Efraim, you and I actually worked on this quite a bit in our time at the University of Pennsylvania. There are a number of ways that policymakers can resolve problems associated with the long run outlook of Social Security financing. So basically, you have outlays and you have revenues. So one obvious answer is that you could increase the tax on workers, and that could contribute to financing the the program. That's just sort of a a very direct way to resolve the issue. But another is to reduce outlays. We can reduce Social Security payments, and it doesn't have to be across the board cuts. This can be something that, if your income is a little bit higher, we can, it can be done in a progressive way that takes care of our let's say, our elderly population that is at most risk of exhausting their financial resources. So to that extent, we can reduce outlays while protecting our most, financially, the people that are in the most financially precarious positions. So there are also a number of other policy levers that we don't always think about. So, for example, increasing the maximum or the normal retirement age. That's a window. There's a window of retirement ages at which we can enter into Social Security with enhanced benefits the longer that we wait. And this is kind of in progress right now. So that window is kind of shifting to older and older ages over time. That's something that can reduce outlays. But Efraim, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that increasing the normal retirement age is kind of a drop in the bucket relative to the magnitude of the projected shortfall in Social Security financing, and we'll need more aggressive policy actions to resolve this.
Yeah, I think that was what the models were showing. The one thing I would add to what you're saying, George, is on the revenue side, we want to be a bit careful there. So raising the payroll tax imposes disincentive effects for workers, which will obviously reduce the labor supply and reduce GDP. So you want to be careful thinking that Social Security can be saved by an increase in the payroll tax. We've done, as I think a lot of economists are doing a lot of work modeling some of these policies. But one of the policies that was considered that Penn Wharton model is the so-called donut hole, where the payroll tax right now taps out. It's what's called the tax max, and then past that you don't pay any payroll tax. So the donut hole policy was to, at some level above that, say at $400,000 in income, you start to impose the payroll tax. And what we found actually is that it was hugely destructive to the economy, because when you start taxing the high earners, you're taxing the most productive people in the economy. And if they stop producing at the level that they were producing to avoid some of this taxation, you really wind up with more harm to GDP than perhaps savings to Social Security.
Thanks, Efraim. Yeah, so the next question I think is an important one. Our economy is becoming more service-oriented. We talk a lot more about efficiency through robotics, artificial intelligence, and we have a lot of maybe a lot less production here in the United States. Is this going to cause a new paradigm for the workplace? What effect does this have on predictions, including debt? Yeah, so there are a number of issues that the question brought up, and it seems totally natural that with an abundance of capital, that a lot of that would be directed towards automation, robotics. Whereas in the past we had a lot of workers working in production lines in the manufacturing sector. Today, a lot of that can be, a lot of what human beings could do in the past, robots can do at least as well at, potentially a lower cost and, more efficiently, effectively, with lower margins of error. So to that extent, it seems totally natural that this transition to, an era of abundant capital could coincide with, continued growth in sort of robots, machinery in the manufacturing industry. So a lot of the employment in manufacturing in the United States is actually high-skilled manufacturing. So these are the jobs, these are the people, maybe a computer programmer that is telling the robot what to do. A lot of uh, a lot of those job opportunities are there and they're growing, and that is kind of a shift in the paradigm of manufacturing in the United States. And it's also freed up a lot of resources in the service sector. So with maybe a decline in the labor force dedicated to manufacturing, it's allowed, you know, a lot of services that weren't available before to be, you know, available and affordable today. So for example, you know, if you live in a house with a lawn and you have a lawn crew that comes and cuts your grass, if you have people that take care of your kids, daycare, we see growth in these areas over time, and that allows for greater specialization in individuals' own, you know, profession. So to that extent, I think that there has been a significant transition towards efficiency, and we might expect that this will continue to grow. And like I talked about earlier, you know, I'm in the Houston area. Efraim is in the Philadelphia area. We're doing this webinar, but it could be that at some point in the future, and you know, we see a lot of this starting even today, that it could be that coworkers are all across the globe, and maybe you're working together on a project, and that could have a significant impact on immigration. But that's not to say that it won't be an improvement in efficiency, just a kind of another way in which the workforce paradigm could end up changing over time. Efraim, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I would just add that, and I think George, you actually were bringing up some of these points, but what we I think want to be careful about is understanding what these jobs are. So on the one hand, you know, this is sort of the bifurcation of the economy. On the one hand, we have these very skilled jobs, as you mentioned, which with increased you know, technological growth, increased capital, become even more valuable. So we're talking about the computer programmers, you know, the skilled laborers, you know, the people with advanced understanding of how to work in the new economy. On the other hand, the other part of the service economy are the people that, as you said, are mowing the lawn, getting your groceries for you. Those jobs are not well paid. They will rise in value only as much as the opportunity cost for the people that can't do it themselves. So there is room for growth there. You know, I think especially with the pandemic, we saw more reliance on things like Instacart and some of these other remote things. But I think the concern that I would have is to look at the economy also at the distributional level, not just the total level. So although this growth in service industry and technological growth may grow the entire pie, I think we have to be mindful here that we've been seeing really a split in what workers are able to earn based on their skills. And, you know, to come back to the question of education, if we create a underclass of undereducated, basically grocery getters, that's not going to do well for the stability of our country, not to mention, you know, the human flourishing of those people.
All right, thank you, Efraim. Well, I think we're just about out of time. We're right at about an hour or so. I'd like to thank everybody for joining in, everybody who listened today. I'd like to thank Efraim for coming here today and sharing his thoughts, and to the Penn Wharton budget model for sharing their results with us. And I'd also like to thank the Baker Institute staff that really does an incredible job helping us out to get these webinars organized. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you all. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me. My information can be found on our website, bakerinstitute.org. And Efraim, would you like to share with the listeners how to access all the research being done by the Penn Wharton budget model?
Well, so thank you, George, for having me on, and thank you to the Baker Institute and all the support staff. It was great to come on and talk about these things. So I think the primary way to reach us is just to go to our website. There's a lot of information there and contact information. You're certainly welcome to reach out to us there. The website is budgetmodel.wharton.upenn.edu.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Efraim. Thanks again to the Baker Institute staff and to everybody who joined in today. Really appreciate it. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to continue the discussion.